Right. Well, I typically start these with asking people their why behind competing in HYROX or whatever sport it is. But I thought with you, maybe we could start like with your new book, like Win the Inside Game. Was there a why behind writing that? What sparked the idea to write the book?
It was dealing with athletes. It was seeing people who I knew were capable of more, who you look at their workouts and you say, oh my gosh, like they're ready to crush this competition. But then when it came to game day or race day, like somehow that they would get in their own way. And to me, like that applies not just to sport, but it applies to life. Like we're all have so much potential, but we end up self-sabotaging or letting the pressure get to us or letting external expectations like overwhelm us and weigh us down. So it's something I faced in my own life, and it's something that I faced with athletes that I worked with on a day-to-day basis. So I wanted to explore, okay, how do we get people to, reach their potential?
Okay, love it, love it. Well, we can dive into all of that hopefully. Uh, I think in the book, like you kind of open up with your experience at Nike and the and like the Oregon project and everything like that. Can you like, tell us a little bit about that experience and like maybe how it sort of shaped some of your perspective on what you talked about in the book?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the long story short is I was just out of graduate school looking for a job and got, essentially what I thought was my dream job. I got hired by Nike to work with their Olympic runners, some of the best in the world, a couple who went on to be Olympic medalists and champions. And that dream job quickly turned into a nightmare because I saw, things or evidence that suggested that things might not all be on the up and up and that there was some shady stuff behind the scenes. So what ended up happening is about a year and a half after I got the job, I left and then I became a whistleblower to report to U.S. anti-doping what I saw. And the long story short on that is 10 years of my life was doing arbitration and talking to lawyers and getting interviewed by the FBI as like this massive investigation took place, and the end result was the coach and then the team physician or doctor got banned by US anti-doping. So I opened the book by telling the story of not my glorious moment where I found my ethics and became a whistleblower or helped clean sport, but when I just kind of went along with it and justified and rationalized and said, okay, you know, this is where I want to be. These are the best of the best. Like, I guess this is okay. We'll just go with it. And I did that for a simple reason. And it's this is that our quest for success can often blind us. And I think if we look at, whether it's the best athletes or successful stories outside of that self, it's the people who really make it and sustain for a really long time. Yes, they want to win. Yes, they have that strong desire and they have that pursuit and all that obsession and all that stuff. But they couple that with enough self-awareness where they're doing it in the way that they want to, and they're aligning, they're keeping their values, ethics, and morals to get there and get what the most they can out of themselves. So that kind of shaped the direction of the book, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, okay. I've heard you talk on I think it was the Modern Wisdom podcast about like your experience in Nike, and there was a bit of like you saw like young athletes, and there was a bit of a slippery slope that they were going down in terms of performance enhancing drugs. It weren't like they just suddenly started on like the best drugs you can get. It was a little bit of a slippery slope, and I just thought I'd sort of touch on this briefly in that like HYROX is growing a lot and there's a lot of athletes coming in. They're very, very motivated and they're trying to get to the elite level. And like HYROX have introduced drug testing now at the elite level of the sport. But is there anything else like you think athletes in the sport and coaches and HYROX themselves should be looking out for, like to help avoid people going down that slippery slope?
Yeah, I think you're spot on because it never starts with, hey, I'm just gonna inject a bunch of shit into my body. right? It always starts on this slippery slope where it's like, okay, oh, maybe I'll try these like supplements that aren't like the standard like creatine, caffeine, protein, etc. Like, let's try the shady stuff over here. And then you're like, okay, well, I'm gonna try these, prescription drugs that maybe weren't meant for this, but might have a performance boosting effect. And you just kind of go further and further. And what happens is, I would caution people, I think the advice I'd give is, often, whether a coach or a physician or people you surround yourself with, they kind of know what they're doing and getting you to go down this slippery slope. Because like once you start justifying and rationalizing, it becomes a snowball of, okay, I can justify this, so I'll take one step further. Oh, I can justify that, I'll take one step further. So I think in a sport like HYROX, where it's like growing and there's obviously a lot of enthusiasm behind it, I think the key is surrounding yourself wisely. Meaning, like, what do you want the sport to be? Like, you're in the infant stages of it. You get to control that. And I think a lot of that is like, who are the people who are, supporting the thing, directing the thing? Who are you surrounding yourself with an athlete? What are the coaches and other athletes you're training with? Like, what do they want out of the sport? And 9 times out of 10, like, we kind of go where our group goes. So if you're with a group that is like training and saying, hey, we just want to, yeah, we want to win, but the whole goal is to explore what in the world our potential is. And I think that's what HYROX is. Like, it developed out of a need of like, hey, we don't have an ability to test ourselves in this unique way, right? Where we're combining strength and endurance at a high level. Like, there's not much else out there. Everything is either like specific endurance or specific strength. And it's a new challenge. So that's the essence of the sport to me from outside. So how do we hold on to that essence of like, this started as a new way to challenge us and see, hey, we're going to combine two things that don't normally go together, and let's test our limits. And if you keep that front and center, like, you're gonna do it in a way that allows you. Because if you start, cheating wildly, you're no longer testing your limits, right? You're using something else to go beyond maybe the limits that are imposed on you from training and psychology and all that stuff. So it's no longer exploration. It's just like win at all costs.
Yeah. You sort of touched on there a little bit about like the group that you're in, and I was going to ask you about environment, and like I guess in your mind, things like the gym you train in, your support network, everything like that is an important factor in life, but certainly in being an athlete. Are there any elements do you think are particularly important there for people to be thinking about?
Yeah, I think so a couple things. This one thing we know is that our environment, essentially, it's contagious with motivation. So if people around us are motivated to perform and improve, we're going to be too. There's all sorts of data and research on this, from exercise to even how well we eat, to even things like obesity. There was a large study that found, like, if more of your friends or neighbors or family are obese, even friends with no genetic component, you're more likely to become obese a couple years later. Why? Because like the motivation is contagious. And I think that applies to our environment we train in. The other thing that I think is really interesting is our ethics too are kind of contagious. So if the environment, says, hey, this is what we believe in, this is how we do things, you're more likely to fall in line with those like core values of the gym that you train in, right? If they go the other way, you're more likely to just cross those lines, because everybody around you, you look around and it's like the old thing our moms told us, right? If Susie jumps off a bridge, will you? Well, it turns out that you probably will if everybody else does, right? So it's like creating that support network in that environment that is like, this isn't just like my friends, this is the direction that I want to go, and these are the values that I want to hold. And if everybody around you is doing that, you're more likely to. There was actually a fascinating study a number of years ago that looked at the Air Force Academy and what made them successful. Because Air Force Academy, you go 4 years into it, you get stuck in your same your same kind of squadron, and they wanted to look at, what made individuals improve or different squadrons improve. And when it came down to it, they found like the least fit person in that group. So if the least fit person like trained and was still like, hey, I know I'm not the best in the squad, but I'm still going to work hard, everyone else improved. If they said, you know what, I'm at the bottom, there's no hope, what's the point? Even if that top of the top person was really good, they tended to not improve as much as other groups because they could look down and be like, hey, not everyone's they're working hard, like it's okay to slack off. So I think it gets at like, we become the people we surround ourselves with. So surround yourself wisely.
Like, as a follow-on from that, do you think it is important for athletes to be like to have a group that they're training in, as opposed to like training alone and spending a lot of time alone? Do you think it's important to have a group and then obviously like find a good group of people to do that with? Have you seen that be important at the elite level?
I do. And I think you see this for a number of reasons. First, is we have all sorts of psychology research that tells us when we're surrounded by other people, it changes our perception of like the difficulty of the task and what we're capable of. One of my favorite studies was actually in lifting, where they took people, I think it was bench press, had them max out, and they either had them max out alone or with a friend sitting there and spotting, but not actually like touching the bar or anything else. And it was something like they lifted, I think it was like 15 pounds more. So it makes a significant difference on like, hey, if someone else is there, we're going to find a way to get that last little bit out of us. And that's really important. And I think more importantly is that what we know is when we surround ourselves with others, it allows us to go through the shitty times, the times when we're like stuck and we've been training so hard, but we can't get the bar, or like our times aren't improving, our intervals training sessions are just going in the tank for whatever reason. When we're with other people, it doesn't hit us as hard. And there's biological research on this. Like when we're alone and we fail, our cortisol level, our stress hormones tends to go through the roof. When we, fail or lose a game or race or what have you, and we have friends nearby afterwards, just to, again, nothing special, but just to, commiserate with and, process what went wrong, our cortisol doesn't rise. Instead, we often get a bump in testosterone. So it's like a positive stress response, even though something negative happened, because like we've got everyone around us who supports us no matter what and says, hey, this isn't the end of the world. We're going to get through this, and we're going to find our way, on the other side of this rut or whatever we're going through. So I think for those two reasons, again, you're going to have to train alone, but if you can find a gym or a group or training partners, that's going to make life a whole lot better.
Yeah. And on race day as well in HYROX is like kind of unique compared to like a marathon, for example, in that you can almost have a spectator watch you at every element of the race because it's just all in one place as opposed to covering 26 miles. So even like just thinking about what support can you have at the race, presumably will be beneficial for most people.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Because it's a jolt of motivation, that's the problem with the marathon is like, you see your supporters like twice, right? And that's not enough. You got too much time in between where it's like, this sucks, let those negative thoughts spiral out. But like in HYROX, again, it's all contained. So if you're seeing your training partner, your spouse, your kids, whatever it is, it gives that jolt of remembering like, hey, I'm not alone. And like, I've got people with me. So like, keep pushing, like, don't let those negative voices spiral out of control.
Yeah. You mentioned in the book, you talk about people being stuck in survival mode. Can you just like touch on what that means and maybe how, like in the context of athletes, how we can recognize if we're in survival mode?
Yeah, what I mean by that is we're stuck in this like heightened threat state, meaning our brain and body kind of default towards like, oh my gosh, I'm under threat. Like if I don't perform, it's the end of the world. Everybody's watching me. and we have this like underlying sense of anxiety, which pushes us to avoidance or apathy, or even like not trying, all in a sense to kind of protect ourselves. And you see this in sport all the time, right? In running, we call it the person who shows up to the race and tells you that they haven't started their like speed or interval training yet. And what are they doing but saying like, I'm giving myself an excuse before the race even starts. And that's the essence of survival mode, because you're just protecting yourself because you're afraid to see what you're capable of doing today and just laying it on the line, because that exposes you, right? And I think in sport, like the whole key is to figure out, how do we get to a point where it's like, hey, who cares? I'm going to put it on the line, and whatever happens, happens, because that's what we get. That's where we get to explore what we're capable of. Sometimes we're going to fall short, but other times we're going to surprise the hell out of us and, pull a performance out where we were like, oh my God, I didn't know I was capable of that. The only way we get there is if we get to risk a little bit, and risk maybe blowing up or embarrassing ourselves or what have you. And the only way we feel that is we get out of that survival mode where we stop thinking about what other people are going to say. We stop thinking about, oh, this is going to go on my results page, or how are people going to feel when I have to post this on Instagram or Strava or social media, whatever it is. Because the problem is now it's like we're all on a stage in a world that is social media of everything. So it feels like, it's the championship of the World Cup or whatever, when it's really just us doing a competition that no one really gives a shit about. but our brain is convinced that it's that life or death. So we've got to give it the evidence that it's like, this isn't life or death. You can take a risk. Let's see what you're capable of. Your friends, your mom, your parents, your coach, they're not going to hate you if you fail. We're going to regroup and get on the horse and get back and figure it out. But that's the only way we get to see what we can do.
Yeah. It's very easy in HYROX actually, like, because your time immediately goes on to like the online leaderboard, and then you can compare your time against everyone in the world ever that's ever done a HYROX, and like see where you're ranking and see where you're ranking by age group, and convinced that everyone's looking up your time, whereas no one really cares. Like,
Exactly. And I would challenge you, like many of us are old enough to remember when we got into sport, is when did we know, like, what helped us get interested in sport? Probably in our class. We were like the fastest at, sport day, or like, we did the best in this. And if you think about it, our comparison was like 20 other kids in our class, right?
Yeah.
It's easy to be good when you're at something, when your comparison point is that. Now imagine if instead of at field day, sport day, like you were competing against every 8-year-old in the freaking country, you would look and you'd be like, I'm not that good. I'm just gonna quit. Why would I sprint or throw things or like play basketball or whatever? I suck compared to everyone else. That's kind of what we're doing, but we need that gate where we feel, hey, I'm pretty good at this. And we've got to almost like create that environment now, because like everything else, points to, hey, we're not good. I mean, I can see it on my own life. I thought I was a great runner in elementary school, but if I went back and compared my times, my wife would have kicked my ass in the mile run. Not because like I wasn't good, but just because like if I compared to everybody in the world and I wasn't training, like of course I'm not going to be that good compared to other people. If I saw that, I wouldn't have taken up running, and I wouldn't have, found a sport that I excelled at. So I think the same thing applies as adults. Is like, it's tempting to go look at that leaderboard and be like, oh my God, I'm, 9,000th in my age group or whatever it is. But like, that's not the point. All that's going to do is get in your own way and convince you that you can't make progress, but you can. You never know what, you never know what's going to happen if you give this months or years of dedication.
Yeah. Presumably, like this kind of like survival mode sort of thought process can lead to like choking and mistakes in sport as well, which I know you touch on in the book. But one question I wanted to ask is, in HYROX, it is easy to make mistakes. Like you can run an incorrect number of laps, for example, or do the stations in the wrong order, and all kinds of opportunities throughout the race to make mistakes. Are there like steps that people can take to sort of help minimize the chances of that happening, or choking in some other way?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way I like to describe it is our brain is predictive. So it's always thinking like, hey, what do I have to do, to take on the challenge that's coming next? But that prediction is dependent on the information we give it. So if you give it good information, meaning you've prepared, you've done the training, you've visualized and dress rehearsed, like, hey, here's what this competition is going to entail. Here's what happens. Not only am I visualizing, hey, this is how I'm going to feel when everything goes right, but also a lot of times, like, hey, this is what I do if I make this mistake. If I miscount a lap, don't let it spiral out of control. Like, this is how I get back on the horse. This is how I refocus, right? And the more good quality information you give your brain, essentially, then in that situation, it doesn't default to like threat mode. It says, hey, this is going to be really difficult, but I know what I'm capable of doing. I know what I'm trying to do. Like, let's take on the challenge. So that's number one, is like, be prepared. The second part of it, I think, is when you're in the competition itself, what you focus on matters, and when you focus matters. So generally those mistakes happen when fatigue is high, and because fatigue is high and that causes some stress, like our brain and our focus starts looking for ways to like distract ourselves or get out of this situation, right? And what we have to know as an athlete is, how do we use different tools to like lock in when the moment matters the most? So for instance, I'll use, my sport in the marathon. This is what I tell people. I say, hey, the first couple miles are really important because you want to find like that pace and rhythm that you're trying to hit and just lock into it. And then once you find it early in the race, your job is like find that pack, find that pace, and then like turn your brain off for a little bit, because you're essentially saying, I'm going to just lock in and just like run with it for a while. But then at some point, when the race starts to get difficult, you can't turn your brain off. You can't distract. You can't like look to Johnny or Susie in the crowd as much. Like, you've got to know when to lock in, because if you don't, what's going to happen is that pace is going to slip. You're going to start, you're not going to notice like you're falling off, or like you're missing the person surging around you, because you're just in distracted mode. So you've got to know when to lock in. And the same thing occurs with HYROX, is you've got to think of like, okay, when are the high pressure or high stress or high fatigue situations where, I can't just distract or like zone out. I've got to be like engaged in the thing. And then you've got to know how to do that. And a lot of that is like, what are you directing your attention to? Like, what is your focus point? What are you telling yourself? What are your mantras while you're going through the difficult thing? There's all sorts of different strategies here. But the more tools you have at your disposal to keep you focused on what actually matters, the better. And then the last thing I'll say as well is like, especially an event like HYROX, is like, it's easy in a long event where you have multiple things to do, is to focus on, okay, I've, in 20 minutes, I'm going to have to do X, Y, and Z. If you're focused on that, you're not paying attention to what you're doing right now in the moment. So you've got to figure out ways how to say, okay, bring it back to the here and now. Bring it back to the next step, the next lap, right? Not 10 minutes from now, 20 minutes from now, 3 exercises from now, like the next lap. Because often we make those mistakes when we get thinking about the future self instead of our current self.
Yeah. I love that last point. That's come up quite a few times actually on this podcast. Even within the stations, like 100 meters of lunges, like not even thinking about the 100 meters, more like the next 10 meters. It's like the mental side of that is huge. I want to talk about mental toughness actually, and like where the mind goes. Like, I often ask athletes where their mind goes when the race gets tough. Are there any sort of specific strategies that you recommend, like when things are getting really hard in a race? Where would you suggest like an athlete's mind goes to help with their moments?
Yeah, so here's the thing is that there is no key thing that's going to work for everyone. But what I tell people is like you want to have as many tools in your toolbox to pull out because you never know what's going to work in that moment. And where do you develop those tools? In training. So training isn't just like physical preparation, it's mental preparation. So whenever you're doing like a hard set or a hard interval session, you shouldn't just think like, okay, I'm just going to get through this. Physically, you should think, what kind of tool am I going to train up today? And what I mean by tools is some of the things that we just talked about, but also some things like how do you talk to yourself? So there's research that shows that if instead of talking to yourself using like, if you switch to second or third person, it creates what we call psychological distance. And your brain essentially listens more and allows you to handle the tough thing better. So instead of saying like, I can do this, it's like, come on, Steve, you can do this. Now it sounds like strange. Why would that matter? But it's because when you use I, your brain kind of numbs it out because that's the voice it hears all the freaking time. If you say like Steve, it's like, oh, it's almost like a friend telling me this. I guess I should pay attention to what's coming next.
Mm.
So you do that, right? And there's actually some research that shows that sometimes even saying it out loud can ingrain it more. This is why often you see like tennis players like muttering to themselves in between sets, I think, because it's just another way to get into your brain and be like, hey, cut that shit out. Like, this is what we need to focus on and what we need to do here. The other thing that I think is really important when you're going through the tough things, and you asked it at the beginning, but I think it's really valid, is like you've got to go back to your why. Like, why did you sign up for this thing? What is your purpose? It's more than just, hey, I'm going to do this because like, it was an interesting challenge. Like there's a why behind us. And the more we have a why or a purpose that is greater than ourselves, the better we're able to handle it. The other thing that matters, I think, in those tough moments too is, and this is where HYROX, as we talked about, can be really beneficial, is like to realize that you're not alone on this journey. When we have others supporting us, it changes our perception of the challenge. It makes it feel a little bit easier, like we can handle it. And the last part is if you're really freaking struggling, is break it down into the smallest step. I mean, we kind of highlighted this, but if you can break it down into the smallest step, you can get through it.
Mhm.
It's the overwhelming. If I thought about running a marathon and said, hey, I got 26.2 or 15 more miles left to go, I'd drive myself nuts, right? Because when fatigue hits, I can't conceptualize that. But I can conceptualize like, hey, get to the next turn, right? Get to the next aid station, like take the next step, hang on to this athlete for 30 seconds, and then we'll reevaluate. When it's really freaking tough, you break it down into the most, the smallest bite-sized chunk that you can handle, and you're essentially bargaining with yourself the rest of the way. And you'll surprise yourself how far that will get you. And in these long competitions, I'm sure you've experienced this too, is you go through rough patches, but then sometimes you get out of those rough patches and you're like, oh, I feel pretty decent again. Like, let's go. So you've just got to remind yourself, okay, this is a rough patch, but I'm going to come out of it. And you just kind of have to bridge that gap until, I call it, you get close enough to where you can smell the finish line. Because once you can see that finish, then that competition, that competitor is going to take over, and you're gonna find some more energy no matter what.
Yeah. I was going to ask you about that sort of last point there, actually, in terms of like, how do you think it should feel in a race? Like, I know I've had good races where it's actually felt quite easy, and you get to the end of it, and it's like, well, did I kill myself as much as I needed to there, or did I have more in the tank? And then sometimes it feels really hard, and you don't do as well. Um, and I think some of that comes about like HYROX races aren't every weekend. I used to play football or soccer, and like you have a match every weekend, whereas that's not the case with HYROX. So it becomes even more important when you do one, and so like then you want to push harder and try harder. But what's your feelings on that? Like, how should a race feel?
That's a great question, and this is the great mystery. And I'm going to give you the answer that might not satisfy you, but it's the truth, is that a lot of the races are going to feel different. And in the sports psychology research, there's this fascinating um, differential between flow and what we call clutch states. And flow states are essentially those races where it's like, hey, this doesn't feel bad. I'm going hard. I'm going fast. I'm having one of my best performances, but it doesn't hurt that bad.
Mm-hmm.
Clutch states are the opposite, where you are having one of your best performances, but it feels like you are fighting for every inch of that race. And what the research tells us is there's these two ways where we can reach the top, but the experience of them is completely different. And why, we don't know exactly, but we know that it's likely due to, like, our various, for whatever reason, like stress response and how our brain and body are kind of like internalizing. And the best example I can give to this is that flow is more similar to, like, there's all sorts of research that shows in war and battles, right? When someone, let's say, gets wounded or shot, non-life-threatening wound or shot, but gets wounded or shot, sometimes they don't feel it when they know that, hey, I've got to get myself and my team to safety. And there's all sorts of reports that show, like, someone will, whatever, finish the mission and then realize, like, oh my gosh, like, I've got a wound in my leg or what have you. And they felt no pain during it. And what the theory is that your brain essentially goes like, hey, this isn't life or death, but like this mission is really important. So we're going to direct all of our resources over here and turn down the pain. And there's some theories that show that, like, experiencing that flow is something similar, where it's like our body goes, hey, this isn't life or death. We're crushing this challenge. Like, we're in it. Turn down the pain. And then there's other situations where it's like the opposite, where our brain is screaming at us to stop. But then half our brain is like, this is so important. We've just got to keep going. I can't turn down the pain, but you can freaking handle it. So my answer is it could go either direction. You've got to be ready. But, like, it's figuring out early on, essentially, like, is this one of those flow states where it's like, hey, I'm in the zone, let's go. And all you try and do there is just ride it, accept it. Like, don't try and get in your way. Don't try and overthink it. If it's one of those clutch states, what you have to do is say, hey, this is going to hurt. But research tells us is having those manageable goals is really important in clutch states. It's the football player who says, hey, we're down by 2 goals. Don't worry about 2 goals. I got to get this next goal, right? And then secondly, in clutch states, research overwhelmingly shows us that we have to make a decision. Meaning, we acknowledge, hey, this kind of sucks, but I'm just going to go for it. And once you make that decision, you don't look back. You say, hey, let's just go for it and see what happens. So the answer is, I have no idea how you're supposed to feel, but you can get to the top in multiple ways. And, like, however you're feeling in that moment, you've just got to figure out, how do I use this to my advantage to, like, get there? And if it hurts a lot, we just got to navigate it.
Do you? We had some elite races relatively recently in Las Vegas in HYROX, and there was a few athletes that pulled out during the race, and it's hard to say definitely what the reasons were, but, like, maybe there was injury and maybe they just weren't feeling right, and, like, obviously not going to win or get the position they wanted. Do you feel like in those instances, if they could have carried on, like if there wasn't an injury preventing it, do you feel like that opens a can of worms by pulling out during those races, or do you feel like that's a mistake maybe?
It totally depends on the situation, but what I will tell you this is, once you pull out of a race, it becomes an option in your brain. Yeah. And again, we have psychology research that essentially, like, once we take an action, our brain goes like, oh, that's a possibility. So now I know it's a possibility. And if we do it again and again, then we're essentially reinforcing that pathway to say it's not just a rare possibility, Like this is a legitimate, like maybe option B or option C. And when we pave that pathway to having a legitimate option, it makes it harder in those moments to resist. Because I'll tell you what, when a couple years ago, I sat down with some of the best marathoners in the U.S. and I asked them, you know, during the marathon, do you ever think about quitting? You know, or ducking into the porta pot and just never coming out, you know? And every hand went up, every hand, but no one had, right? No one had done it because they realized that, like, unless, you know, injury or what have you, but because they realized, like, hey, like, if I open up this pathway for not a like super serious reason that, you know, my brain can connect it to, then I'm going to want to think about doing that more often and more often and more often. So I think you're spot on. Again, there's some situations where it totally makes sense, you know, injury, big illness, whatever, something like that. But if it's just because, hey, I'm out of the medals, I'm out of the prize money, whatever it is, that can be a dangerous, you know, slope to go down.
Yeah, yeah. On the sort of subject of mental toughness, there's obviously like talk of a central governor that we have that maybe like reins us in endurance sports. Uh, and you know, I've heard different quotes around this in terms of like David Goggins kind of, I think, says like, when you think you're done, you're like 40% done, and I've heard 70%. Do you have a feeling around that? Do you put a percentage on it? Like, what's your take on it when you feel you're done? Where are you?
That's a good question. I have no idea. I think it's pretty much impossible because no one actually gets to like zero. You
Yeah,
know, like this is the problem is we have no idea. Like we can say like, you know, maybe someone like Eliud Kipchoge in the marathon gets close, but I guarantee you, if we were to look into his muscles and like do all this stuff, he would have more energy left and more, you know, more to go. So I think it's really freaking impossible. But to me, I think that's the hopeful message because we have no idea, but we know it's more than whatever you have right now. And the way I like to think of it is it's kind of like, you know, in most cars nowadays, they tell you when you're about to run on empty. They tell you, you know, we've got 100 miles left to go before our car runs out of gas. But if you drive all the way to zero, you're not actually out of gas because like the car makers are smart. They build in a buffer zone. You can go probably 15, 20, 30 miles after that and still have gas because they realize people are stupid. Um, our brain is similar in the sense that it suggests that governor is essentially like, hey, this person's crazy. They're gonna push all the way until actual zero. So we're gonna convince them zero is at 30 miles to go, you know, and whatever it is. And I think the message there is to realize that, to accept that, and then say, okay, like how can I figure out how to push a little further? How can I get closer to empty, knowing that I'm gonna be okay and my brain, you know, isn't gonna, we're not gonna hit catastrophe. So I think that's the name of the game, whether you're talking about running marathon or HYROX, is like, how do I convince myself that I'm not done? I'm not at zero. There is more left in the tank. And that's really freaking hard because your brain is built to protect you. So instead of the car telling us at zero, the brain's mechanism is to make us feel pain and suffering and fatigue because it knows if we overwhelm him or her with pain and suffering and fatigue, they will voluntarily slow down. We won't have to make them slow down.
yeah. I know you mentioned in the book briefly about you used to at high school, you used to do a find God workout, was it? Like
Yeah.
every now and then, which presumably sort of helps you to push that governor a little bit more. Do you recommend athletes still do that now?
Yeah, I do. I do. I think it's a rare occasion. Like if you're trying to do it too much, you're not going to get the most out of yourself. But if every once in a while, what you do is you say, hey, the whole point of this workout is to get as close to zero as I can. Again, be rested and recovered and fueled going into it, but it's to get as close as I can. If I start slowing down on my intervals, if I can't lift as much weight, if I can't do as many lunges, whatever it is, that's fine. The point is to go until you're, splayed out on the track. And it's just like, I can't do it anymore is what it feels like. And what happens is those are perspective shifters. It's essentially you convincing your brain like, hey, we can go a little bit more. Like, remember, like we've been in this place before. Shift that perspective of what we're capable of. So absolutely, I would recommend it. Going back to what we talked about at the beginning, get a group of friends, do it every once in a while, but say, hey, today the goal is be splayed out on the track afterwards and, go home and might not be able to function a little bit, but like, let's see what we can do.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think it's possible to like care too much about your performance in the sport? Like, there's some people come on this podcast and say like they're all in on HYROX, they're giving it everything, but is there a balance? Can you care too much? Can being all in affect your performance adversely, would you say?
Absolutely. And here's why. It comes down to our brain being protective again. If HYROX is the only thing that matters, if it is like the only thing that defines yourself, if you're saying this is it, what happens is our brain goes like, okay, I get the message. This is do or die. And what happens is, contrary to what we see on social media, we don't perform best do or die, because your brain goes, not how am I going to get the most out of ourselves, but how am I going to protect myself to not die? In this case, it's maybe not literal death, but it's like psychological death of like, my world is destroyed because I didn't reach my HYROX goal, right? My self-esteem is plummeted. So it's okay, but we have to balance like caring deeply with just enough. I'm not saying like detach completely, but just enough where we let go a little bit, where we say like, this is super important, but it's not life or death. I have other things in my life. And in fact, if you look at elite performers, you often see this. My favorite example from the book is like the legendary skateboarder Tony Hawk, who was trying to nail the trick that he became famous for, the 900, and he couldn't do it. And one of his skateboarding friends and colleagues told him, hey man, risk not winning, which essentially meant like, let go a little bit, stop focusing on the outcome and get back to like, hey, why did you get into skateboarding? Which is like, it's fun to explore my limits. It's a fun activity. I get some joy out of that. He did that and he hit the trick. And I think this is so often what you see is like, we've got to care deeply, but we've got to balance that out with like, if we care too much, we're going to tense up. It's almost like in track, I like to use the example of Usain Bolt running the 100, where if you watch him perform, it's incredible, right? He's running whatever, 9.5, whatever, and he's putting so much force into the ground. But if you watch him before the race, what is he doing? He's joking around, right? He's relaxed. Even if you watch him during the race, he's trying so hard, but his face and upper body are as relaxed as possible, because that's what we're after. How do we care a lot, want to perform to our best, try really hard, but we're not straining and forcing our way to do it, because that straining and forcing will create tension. It's the same when we talk about caring deeply. If we care too much tension, too much pressure, we got to take it off just enough so that we can free ourselves up to perform.
Yeah, love it. Funnily enough, that's something that's come up a few times on here as well, like the risk, not winning. And one that springs to mind, we had Eve Muirhead, like an Olympic gold medalist on, and she said like the thing that changed for her in the Olympics that she won was like not being afraid to lose anymore. That was the big change for her, and then like freed her up, and her performance like was enhanced as a result. Are there any? I know it's like I know the book's relatively recently out. Is there anything in the book that we've not touched on that is easy to skim over, but you think is particularly important and worth talking about?
Oh gosh, that's a great question. There probably is, but I'm on a blank on it right now. I'll say this. Here's the other thing that I think is important is that like in the book, especially for competition, is that that how we frame wins and losses impacts like our brain's prediction and like how we approach the next thing.
Mhm.
So there's this whole psychology and biology that tells us like when we win, we get this bump in testosterone I mentioned earlier, which helps us be, aggressive and take calculated risks for the next time and makes us more likely to win or compete well. And when we lose, we get that negative stress response of cortisol, and we start going down a bad path. But what research tells us is that how we handle both the wins and losses, like influence that biology. So if we go into the doldrums and we just like lose our mind and like throw a pity party after the loss, our brain goes, okay, next time we're going to put more cortisol into your system because like we want to avoid this situation. If you handle it by hanging out with friends, by processing, by keeping it informational instead of personal, here's what I learned. How do I take this forward? You don't get that huge cortisol response afterwards. So I think I call it, we have this sensitive period after our competitions where win or lose, like our brain's going to internalize how should we feel about this and what should we carry into the next one. If you take advantage of that and learn to win and lose well, you're going to be in a much better spot.
Interesting. This has been brilliant. Thank you. There's a couple of questions we typically finish up on, and one of which is, what's been your best ever sporting experience? Does anything spring to mind?
My best ever sporting experience. Oh gosh. Does that have to be as an athlete or yeah. Um I mean my mind goes back to those races where it just felt easy and simple, right? I remember one race where I ran a shade over a 4-minute mile, and the whole race I was like, you know what? I don't feel any pain. I don't know if I can go any faster, but I'm just like in the groove and rolling. And those are the moments that are great. The philosopher Joseph Campbell, who essentially inspired the work of Star Wars and George Lucas, he called those moments feeling alive,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where we just feel alive. And I think those are the sporting moments. There's been a handful of them I've participated in, or, as a coach, you experience this as well, where it just makes you feel alive. And those moments, it's like, you just want to capture that bottle up and, relive it.
Love it. And then one last one. The question is typically, what's been the best piece of advice someone's given you while training for HYROX? And I know you're not all in on HYROX, but like in terms of just endurance sport, is there one piece of best advice that springs to mind?
Yeah. So the best advice, I wasn't given this personally, but I read it, is Frank Shorter, who won the Olympic gold medal for America in the marathon way back in 1972. He was asked, what does it take? And he essentially said, you need to do 2 hard workouts, a long run, and as much training as you can handle. Do that for years on end, and then come back to me. And his point was like, yeah, we can get all fancy and all this stuff, but it is literally the consistency in the work, whatever it is for, your sport, being consistent at that for months and years on end. And that's the only way we see how good we can be.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Love it. All right, awesome. Well, thank you for this. Is there? I mean, obviously, we've touched on the new book. Do you want to just tell us a little bit more about that and where people want to go if they want to find out more about you and so on?
Absolutely. New book just came out, Win the Inside Game. It's basically on the achievement success without being miserable. So the mental side of sport and life, and how to navigate it all, winning and losing, all that stuff. You can buy it wherever books are sold. It's basically everywhere. You can check out my stuff. I'm on all social media at Steve Magness, or stevemagness.com as well.
Awesome. Thank you. Really appreciate it. It's been great.
Thanks so much, Greg.